We've all heard tales of hunger. Soldiers starving on rations, explorers eating their boots. But almost nobody talks about the uncomfortable parts of history, the medical cases that defy belief. The man who could eat a meal for 15 laborers and still be hungry. The human stomach that became a weapon of war. The hospital where a 14-month-old child simply vanished. This isn't a story about hunger. It's a story about a void. A man from late 18th century France named Tarare, who was a walking, eating abyss, a medical horror show that doctors tried to understand and generals tried to use. And it all ends with a single question that still hangs in the air. What or who did he eat? This is the documented medical case of the man whose appetite could not be filled. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the 19th century London Medical and Physical Journal and the original reports of French military surgeon Baron Percy. Now back to the story. He was born around the year 1772, in a village near Lyon, France. We don't know his real name. History only remembers him by his nickname, Tarare. From the very beginning, he was different. As a boy, he was a walking famine. He was constantly, painfully hungry. By his teenage years, he could reportedly eat an entire quarter of a bullock in a single 24-hour period, an amount of meat equal to his own body weight. He was of average height, around 5 feet 4 inches, but rail-thin. At the age of 17, he weighed only 100 pounds. His parents were poor farmers working the rocky soil outside Lyon. They could not feed him. He was a drain on their resources they simply could not sustain. The family's grain stores would vanish in days when they were meant to last months. They forced him out of the house. They turned their son, with his monstrous, inexplicable hunger, out onto the road to fend for himself. So he did what he had to do. He fell in with a traveling band of charlatans, thieves, and prostitutes who worked the roads between Lyon and Paris. He turned his affliction into a performance. He became a street act. He would pass a hat, and for a few coins he would eat. Not food. He would swallow corks, stones, and entire baskets of apples, one after the other. His most popular trick was eating live animals. He would catch a stray cat, break its bones with his powerful jaws, and swallow it whole, fur and all. He would later vomit up the skin and fur in a neat, clean pile. He did the same with snakes and eels, swallowing them headfirst while they were still writhing. The crowd would watch, horrified and fascinated, dropping copper coins into his hat while backing away in disgust. His physical appearance was as unsettling as his appetite. He had an unusually wide mouth that could stretch to accommodate objects the size of a man's fist. His teeth were heavily stained yellow and brown from stomach acid that frequently came up his throat. His lips were almost invisible, thin lines that disappeared when his mouth was closed. When he hadn't eaten, his skin would hang so loosely from his belly that he could wrap the fold of it around his waist like a leather belt. When he had eaten, his stomach would distend like a massive balloon, stretching so tight that you could see the outline of whatever he had consumed moving underneath the skin. His body was always hot to the touch, burning with a fever that never broke, and he sweated constantly, even in winter. He reeked. The records, written by doctors who examined him, describe his body odor as so foul that you could not stand within 20 paces of him without retching. It was the smell of decay, of something rotting from the inside out. He was a medical curiosity, a freak show, a man whose own body was a prison of unending, ravenous hunger. Then came the revolution. The War of the First Coalition began in 1792, and France needed every able-bodied man it could find. Tarare, like so many other young men desperate for steady meals and a uniform, joined the French Revolutionary Army in 1793. This is where his story moves from the sideshow tent into the pages of medical history. The army quartermasters tried to feed him. They gave him quadruple rations, 4 times the daily allowance of bread, meat, and soup that sustained a normal soldier. It wasn't enough. He would finish his own food in minutes and then scavenge through the garbage piles behind the mess tents, eating potato peels, discarded bones with traces of meat still clinging to them, and scraps that other soldiers wouldn't feed to their horses. He was constantly exhausted, a walking skeleton in a soldier's blue uniform, his cartridge belt hanging loose around his sunken waist. His commanding officers didn't know what to do with him. He was too weak to march long distances, too distracted by hunger to follow complex orders, and his smell made it impossible for other soldiers to share quarters with him. In 1794, he collapsed during a winter march near the Rhine. He was admitted to the military hospital at Soultz, in Alsace, eastern France. There, he came to the attention of two of the top surgeons in the French army. Dr. Corville, the head of surgery at Soultz, and the chief surgeon, Baron Dominique Jean Larry, a man who would become famous as Napoleon's personal physician and revolutionize battlefield medicine. But it was another surgeon, Baron Percy, who would document Terrare's case in exhaustive detail. These men were scientists first, soldiers second. They were fascinated. They had never seen anything like him. They decided to conduct a series of controlled experiments. They put him in a room with a meal prepared for 15 German laborers who had been captured and were working on French fortifications. It included 2 enormous meat pies, each the size of a carriage wheel, plates of salt pork and beef grease, a dozen loaves of black bread, and 4 gallons of milk. Tarare ate all of it, every last scrap. He consumed the entire feast in under 40 minutes, methodically working his way through each dish without pausing to breathe. Immediately after, his belly swelled up hard and tight, like a massive drum stretched to its breaking point. His skin was so taut it looked like it might split. He fell asleep immediately, snoring loudly, his distended stomach rising and falling like a bellows. They tested his limits systematically, like natural philosophers studying a new species. They brought him a live cat. Baron Percy wrote in his detailed notes that Tarare tore open the cat's abdomen with his teeth, drank its blood while it was still warm, and ate the entire animal, leaving only the bare skeleton picked completely clean. The consumption took less than 10 minutes. He did the same with snakes, lizards, and puppies from the hospital's kennels. He was once presented with a live eel, nearly 2 feet long and as thick as a man's wrist, which he swallowed whole after crushing its head with his teeth. His jaw strength was remarkable. Percy measured the force and found it equal to that of a large dog. His body was a biological impossibility, and the doctors were determined to understand it. They couldn't. All they could do was watch, take detailed measurements, and try to keep him from eating the other patients. The surgeons documented everything. Percy's notes, preserved in the French military medical archives, record that Terrare's normal body temperature was 102 degrees Fahrenheit. His pulse was consistently above 100 beats per minute, even at rest. His breathing was rapid and shallow, like a man who had been running. Most disturbing of all, when they examined his throat with the crude instruments of the time, they could see straight down into his stomach cavity. His esophagus was so abnormally wide that it was like looking down a well. When he opened his mouth fully, which he could do to an extraordinary degree, the doctors could observe his stomach contracting and expanding like a separate, living creature. General Alexander de Beauharnais, stepfather to the future Josephine Bonaparte and commander of the Army of the Rhine, heard about the man who could swallow anything. He was fighting a war where information was power, where a single intercepted message could save or doom thousands of soldiers. He had an idea. Could Tarare be used as a spy? A secret courier who could carry messages where no one would think to look? The plan was simple and grotesque. Tarare would swallow a small wooden box containing a secret message. He would then travel behind enemy lines, allow nature to take its course, and deliver the message intact. Baron Percy was ordered to test the theory scientifically. The trial run took place in March of 1794. Percy constructed a wooden box, 2 inches long and 1 inch wide, containing a test message written on waterproof parchment. He wrapped it in a piece of raw beef to make it easier to swallow. Tarare consumed it without hesitation, washing it down with a quart of water. Percy monitored him around the clock. 32 hours later, the box emerged from his system, intact and undamaged. The message inside was perfectly legible. The experiment was declared a success. As a reward, General de Beauharnais presented Tarare with a wheelbarrow filled with 30 pounds of raw bull's lungs and liver, still bloody from the slaughterhouse. In front of the assembled generals and their staff, Tarare ate the entire mass immediately. His hands and face covered in blood, pieces of organ meat falling from his mouth as he stuffed more in. The officers watched in fascinated horror. He was ready for his mission. If you appreciate these deep dives into the strange corners of history, hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to support more content like this. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Baron Percy's original medical reports and 19th century French military archives. Now, back to the story of a man who became a weapon. His first and only mission as a spy began in late March of 1794. He was disguised as a German peasant, given rough clothes and a forged passport identifying him as Heinrich Müller from Bavaria. The message he carried, sealed in its wooden box and nestled in his stomach, contained troop movements for a planned French offensive near Landau. General de Beauharnais sent him across the Rhine at night, with orders to make contact with a French colonel who was reportedly being held prisoner in a Prussian camp near Neustadt. The plan fell apart almost instantly. Tarare spoke no German beyond a few basic words like bread and water. When Prussian border guards stopped him, his story made no sense. A peasant from Bavaria who couldn't speak German properly, traveling alone through a war zone, with no trade goods or clear destination. He was captured by the Prussian 4th Infantry Regiment within 18 hours of crossing the border. They searched him thoroughly, found nothing suspicious in his clothes or belongings, and assumed he was just a lost farmer, possibly simple-minded. But under questioning, which likely involved the standard interrogation techniques of the era, beatings, sleep deprivation, and threats, he broke completely. Within 2 days, he told them everything. He revealed that he had swallowed a box containing a vital message for the French army. The Prussian commander, General Zoegli, a veteran of campaigns against the Turks, had never heard anything so absurd. But he was taking no chances with potential French intelligence. He had Tarare chained to a latrine in the camp's prison yard and ordered his soldiers to wait. They kept him under constant guard, watching him relieve himself, waiting for the promised box to emerge. The soldiers made bets on how long it would take. Some of them had fought in enough campaigns to have seen stranger things than a man who swallowed secret messages. 30 hours later, on a cold morning in early April, the box appeared. General Zoegli broke it open with his own hands, expecting military secrets that could change the course of the war, detailed battle plans, or intelligence about French artillery positions. Instead, the message was a single line in French. Let us know if this was delivered successfully. It was signed by Colonel Lehman, de Beauharnais' aide-de-camp. The general realized he had been played for a fool. The French had used Tarare as a test case, a way to see if their bizarre courier system actually worked. They had wasted his time and resources with a meaningless message. The humiliation was complete. General Zoegli was furious. He ordered his men to take Tarare to the camp's gallows, a permanent wooden structure used for deserters and spies, and stage a mock execution. They put a rough hemp noose around his neck and hoisted him up until his feet barely touched the ground. For several minutes, they let him dangle, gasping and choking, his face turning purple, while Zoegli screamed at him in German that he didn't understand. At the last second, just before he lost consciousness, they cut him down. His body hit the ground like a sack of grain. They gave him one final, systematic beating with rifle butts and boots, breaking at least 2 of his ribs, and dragged him to the Rhine. They threw him back across the French lines like a piece of refuse. The career of Tarare the spy was over before it had truly begun. He returned to the hospital at Solz a broken man, both physically and mentally. The mock execution had terrified him in a way that constant hunger never had. For the first time in his life, he had faced something worse than the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the prospect of death. He begged Baron Percy to cure him, to find some treatment, some surgery, some medicine that would make the hunger stop. He said he would do anything, submit to any experimental procedure, if it would just give him peace. Percy was genuinely moved by his desperation. Using the limited medical knowledge of the late 18th century, He tried everything he could think of. He started with opium. He fed Tarare massive doses of laudanum, a powerful tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, enough to kill a normal man. The drug knocked him unconscious for hours at a time. But when he woke up, the hunger was still there, as strong as ever. Percy tried wine vinegar, believing it might somehow shrink his abnormally large stomach. He prescribed tobacco pills, a common treatment for digestive disorders. He attempted to regulate Tarare's eating with a strict diet of soft-boiled eggs, one every hour, thinking that constant small meals might satisfy him where large ones had failed. None of it worked. The hunger was too deeply embedded in his body, too fundamental to his biology to be cured by 18th century medicine. The failed treatments only made Tarare's desperation worse. His behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He was caught multiple times sneaking out of the hospital at night to eat the discarded organs and entrails from the local butcher's shop, cramming raw liver and intestines into his mouth with both hands. He fought with packs of stray dogs in the gutters over scraps of carrion, beating them off with sticks to claim rotting pieces of meat. Hospital orderlies found him in the morgue on 3 separate occasions, attempting to eat the bodies of the dead, tearing at corpses with his fingernails when his teeth couldn't penetrate the cold skin. Most horrifying of all, he was caught drinking blood directly from patients who were being treated with bloodletting, the common medical practice of draining blood to restore bodily balance. He would wait until the medical attendants were distracted, then lap up the warm blood like an animal. The hospital staff was horrified and increasingly frightened. Orderlies refused to work the night shift alone. Patients complained that they couldn't sleep, knowing that Tarare was somewhere in the building, possibly hungry enough to attack them. The other doctors pressured Percy to have him removed. They argued that he was a danger to everyone in the hospital, a creature driven by appetites that made him more beast than man. Baron Percy defended him as long as he could, insisting that Tarare was a medical case, a man suffering from a disease beyond his control, deserving of treatment rather than abandonment. But even Percy's scientific curiosity and humanitarian instincts had limits. Then, in September of 1794, the final line was crossed. A 14-month-old child, the baby son of one of the hospital's laundresses, disappeared from the hospital grounds. The child, named Jean-Baptiste, had last been seen sleeping in a wooden cradle in the laundry room while his mother worked. When she returned from hanging clothes in the courtyard, the cradle was empty. A massive search was launched immediately. Every room in the hospital was turned upside down. The surrounding countryside was combed by soldiers and local volunteers. Ponds were dragged. Wells were searched. The baby was nowhere to be found. Immediately, without a word being spoken, all eyes turned to Tarare. There was no direct evidence. No one had seen him take the child. The baby's body was never found. But the suspicion was overwhelming and unanimous. The man who ate live cats and tried to consume human corpses was the only logical suspect. The hospital staff, the other patients, even some of the doctors who had worked with him, were convinced that his uncontrollable hunger had finally driven him to the ultimate transgression. This was an act so heinous that even Baron Percy, his defender and protector, could not excuse it or explain it away. Publicly, Percy could no longer protect him. The weight of suspicion, the horror of the staff, and the demands of military discipline made Tarare's position impossible. He was formally discharged from the army and driven out of the hospital by a mob of soldiers and orderlies who threw stones and refuse at him as he fled. He vanished into the chaos of revolutionary France, a country torn apart by war, political upheaval, and economic collapse. For 4 years, the medical world heard nothing of him. He simply disappeared back into the shadows, another casualty of a nation devouring itself. 4 years later, in 1798, Baron Percy received an urgent message from a colleague, Dr. Tessier, at a hospital in Versailles. They had a patient they desperately wanted him to examine. The man was in the final stages of what they believed was tuberculosis, the wasting disease that was claiming thousands of lives across France. He was weak, bedridden, and suffering from a constant, debilitating case of exudative diarrhea that had left him little more than a skeleton covered in loose skin. But there was something familiar about him, something that reminded Dr. Tessier of the medical reports he had read years earlier. The patient's name was Tarare. Percy traveled to Versailles immediately. He found his former patient near death, but barely recognizable. The man who had once eaten meals for 15 people could now barely swallow a cup of broth. The insatiable hunger that had defined his entire existence was gone, replaced by a deep, wasting sickness that was consuming him from within. His famous gut, once capable of stretching to accommodate impossible quantities of food, had collapsed inward. His skin, which had once been tight and hot with fever, now hung gray and cold from his bones. He was dying slowly, and he knew it. Tarare lived for only a few more days after Percy's arrival. He died on a rainy morning in July 1798, at the age of 26. His last words, according to the hospital records, were spoken to Baron Percy. "I am still hungry. Even death, it seemed, could not satisfy the void that had consumed his life." But even in death, Tarare had one last secret to give up to science. Baron Percy, despite the vociferous protests of the other doctors who were repulsed by the idea of cutting open such a diseased body, insisted on performing a complete autopsy. The stench from the corpse was so overwhelming that they had to burn incense and vinegar-soaked rags throughout the procedure just to remain in the room. Several medical students who had volunteered to assist fled before the first incision was made. What they found defied medical understanding. When Percy opened Tarare's mouth and throat, they could see all the way down into his abdominal cavity, as if they were looking down a broad, open tunnel. His gullet was abnormally wide, nearly 4 inches in diameter, lined with scar tissue from years of swallowing objects that were never meant to pass through a human throat. His liver was grossly enlarged, nearly twice the normal size, and his gallbladder was so distended with bile that it looked like a small balloon. But the stomach was the true source of horror. It was immense, filling most of his abdominal cavity, larger than Percy had ever seen in man or beast. When they opened it, the smell was so putrid that 2 of the doctors vomited immediately. The stomach walls were completely flaccid, hanging like empty cloth, and covered in weeping ulcers that had been eating through the tissue for months. The entire organ was, in Percy's clinical words, putrefied, and filled with pus and partially digested matter that defied identification. His body had been rotting from the inside out, consumed by the very organ that had made him famous. The final autopsy report, preserved in the archives of French military medicine, contains one last chilling observation. Percy noted that Tarare's intestines were unusually long and abnormally wide, as if his entire digestive system had evolved to process quantities of food that no normal human could consume. The doctors who dissected him left a note that has become part of medical legend. They wrote that his stomach was not an organ, but a chasm, and that his life had not been a human existence, but an abyss made flesh. The case of Tarare remains one of the most disturbing and inexplicable medical mysteries in recorded history. Modern doctors who have studied Percy's detailed reports have proposed various theories: a severe thyroid disorder, a form of brain damage affecting the hypothalamus, or a genetic condition so rare that it has never been properly identified. But none of these explanations fully account for the extremity of his condition or the horror of his final years. He was a man whose body became his enemy, whose greatest need became his greatest curse, and whose hunger was so profound that it may have driven him to cross the final boundary between human and monster. The question that Baron Percy asked in his final report still echoes through medical history. What disease could create such an appetite, and what appetite could drive a man to consume not just food, but life itself? The answer died with Tarare, buried in a pauper's grave outside Versailles. But the mystery of the man who could never be filled continues to haunt anyone who hears his story.